And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Today's sea ice analysis showing the ice edge here north of St. Matthew Island, southwest of Nunivak Island as it has been, and then less ice as you head in toward Bristol Bay. But with the pattern we have for the next couple of days, look for the ice to actually retreat here and diminish a little bit in Bristol Bay, and also retreat back to the north here south of Nunivak Island, while more of an east-northeast wind up here will carry the ice flows more off to the west and southwest. And strong storm tonight moving up toward Unalaska Island, slowly weakening, but still at 942 millibars. High wind warning out for Bristol Bay, blizzard warning out for the Kuskokwim Delta. Blizzard warning continues to the Arctic coast, and a high wind warning here, north central interior areas. Otherwise, pretty windy across much of interior Alaska with lighter winds for the panhandle. For tomorrow, this low crosses into the Bering Sea there, weakens to about 948 millibars, so winds will be lighter in these areas, but still quite windy conditions here. And gales continue on the eastern Arctic coast through Thursday, actually. Quite windy there, especially for areas like Delta Junction. New low center develops here, increasing the winds and precipitation for the North Gulf Coast. They'll start to press in toward the southeast coast, but that front weakens and holds off the coast there on Thursday for the panhandle, so occasional light precipitation there through Thursday. And winds still windy over interior Alaska, but not as windy, although still high-end gales going on the eastern Arctic coast. And for the coastal water forecast here, central and south coast of the panhandle, southeast winds 30 knots. For the north coast, east to southeast winds 25 to 40 knots. For the day Wednesday, Lynn Canal, north winds at 15. Stevens Passage, north winds 20 knots, and southeast winds 30 knots for Clarence Strait. Moving on to Thursday, small craft advisories for the south coast, southerlies at 25 knots, central coast south at 20, and the north coast south to southeast 15 to 20 knots. Lynn Canal, south 25, gusting 40 knots, south 25 for Stevens Passage. Clarence Strait, south winds 20 knots, seas there at about 10 feet. And for Prince William Sound tomorrow, look for east winds at 25 knots. Gale warnings for the North Gulf Coast, east winds 35 knots. Cook Inlet, small craft advisories, northeast winds 25 to 30 knots. Gale warnings for the Barren Islands and for Kamishak Bay, east winds 40 knots. And then those turn southeast, diminish to 25 knots there for Kamishak Bay and the Barren Islands on Thursday. Cook Inlet also seeing diminishing winds, northeast 15 to 20 knots. Light southeast winds at 10 for Prince William Sound, and south to southeast winds 15 to 20 knots there for the North Gulf Coast. Kodiak Island tomorrow, east to southeast winds at 25 knots. And we've got southeast winds or south-southeasterlies at 30 to 40 knots for the Alaska Peninsula. Gale warnings for Bristol Bay, east winds 35 knots. And for the day on Thursday, we've got south to southwest winds 25 to 30 knots for the Alaska Peninsula, Bristol Bay, southeast to 25, and south winds 25 knots for Kodiak Island. Eastern Aleutians, west-northwest winds tomorrow at 30 knots, and for Adak and Atka, west to northwest, 40 to 45 knots with gale warnings covering the western Aleutians, all out of the northwest. And for the day on Thursday, Kiska to Shemya, northwest 30 knots. Kiska to Adak, west at 40 knots. In fact, Kiska to Atka, west at 40 knots. And the eastern Aleutians, gale warnings also, west winds 35 knots. And for the southwest coast tomorrow, gale warnings, east winds 35 to 40 knots. St. Lawrence Island, Norton Sound, gale warnings also for northeast winds 35 to 40 knots. Pribilofs and St. Matthew Island, northeast winds 35 to 40 knots for Wednesday. Lighter winds in store for Thursday, but still gales for St. Matthew Island out of the northeast at 35 knots. Pribilofs down to 25 knots from the north. Small craft or brisk wind advisories here for the southwest coast, St. Lawrence Island and Norton Sound. All those areas looking at northeast winds at 25 knots. For the Arctic coast tomorrow, gale warnings, east winds 40 knots here, central and eastern coast, west side east at 35 knots, east-northeast 35 knots there for the Chukchi Sea. And then for Thursday, Lighter winds here for the Chukchi Sea, but still good gales going up here on the central and eastern Beaufort Sea coastline, up to 45 knots out of the east there, and lighter winds 20 to 30 knots from the east-northeast for the Chukchi Sea.